Tonight we travel back to 1812 to witness one of history's most catastrophic military disasters, not decided by brilliant strategy or superior weapons, but by something far more merciless and impartial: the brutal Russian winter that consumed an entire army. Before we begin, where are you listening from, and what time is it there? Perhaps you're warm and comfortable, safe from the elements, surrounded by heating and shelter that the soldiers of Napoleon's Grand Army could never have imagined. Hold on to that warmth as we journey back to a time when cold itself became a weapon more deadly than any cannon, when frost and snow killed more men than all the battles combined, and when survival through a single night became an achievement worth celebrating. This is the story of the French invasion of Russia, of the 600,000 men who marched east in the summer of 1812, and of the frozen hell they encountered on their retreat. But more than military history, this is the story of how ordinary soldiers, farmers' sons from France and Italy and Poland and Germany, faced cold so severe it seemed supernatural, how they discovered what the human body could endure before it simply gave up, and how a few managed to survive when survival seemed utterly impossible. Close your eyes and imagine yourself standing at the border of the Russian Empire in June 1812, part of the largest army Europe had ever assembled. You're young, perhaps 20 or 22 years old, conscripted from your village in Normandy or Bavaria or the Italian countryside. You've heard stories of glory, of Napoleon's invincibility, of the great adventure that awaits. The summer sun is warm on your face, your uniform is new, your musket feels solid in your hands. The future seems bright with possibility. You cannot possibly know that within 6 months you'll be stumbling through snow in temperatures that drop to 40 degrees below zero, wearing rags wrapped around your frozen feet, surrounded by the corpses of your companions, struggling simply to take one more step through drifts that seem determined to claim you, just as they've claimed tens of thousands of others. The story begins not with winter, but with summer's heat and Napoleon's ambition. Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of France, had conquered most of Europe by 1812. Only Britain remained defiant in the west, and Russia, vast and unconquerable, loomed in the east. Tsar Alexander then had broken the continental system, Napoleon's economic blockade against Britain, and the emperor could not tolerate such defiance. So Napoleon assembled an army unlike anything the world had seen. The Grande Armée numbered approximately 600,000 men, French, Italian, Polish, German, Dutch, Swiss, Croatian, and Portuguese soldiers, the largest invasion force in European history to that point. The logistics alone were staggering. Thousands of wagons carrying food, ammunition, medical supplies and equipment, herds of cattle driven along to provide fresh meat, artillery trains with hundreds of cannons, cavalry units with tens of thousands of horses. Imagine being part of this massive migration of humanity and animals and equipment, stretching for miles along primitive Russian roads. The dust raised by 600,000 marching feet creates clouds that hang in the summer air. The noise is constant. Boots tramping, wagon wheels creaking, horses neighing, sergeants shouting orders, soldiers singing marching songs in a dozen different languages. You're part of something unprecedented, something that feels invincible simply by virtue of its size. How could any enemy stand against such numbers? How could Russia, however vast, resist such overwhelming force? Napoleon had defeated every army he'd faced for more than a decade. This campaign would be no different. You'd march to Moscow, the Russians would surrender, and you'd be home by autumn with stories of glory and perhaps some plunder to show for your service. But the Russian commanders, led by Mikhail Kutuzov, understood something Napoleon didn't fully appreciate. Russia's greatest weapon wasn't its army. It was space and time and climate. The country was so vast that armies could be swallowed by its distances. The primitive road network meant that moving and supplying large forces became nearly impossible. And the climate, with its extremes of summer heat and winter cold, could destroy armies that the Russian military couldn't defeat in battle, so the Russians retreated. As Napoleon's army advanced, Russian forces fell back, refusing the decisive battle that Napoleon desperately wanted. They burned crops and supplies as they withdrew, implementing a scorched earth policy that left the French army nothing to forage or requisition. Every village the Grande Armée entered had been stripped bare. No food, no fodder for the animals, often no shelter as buildings had been burned. The advance through summer Russia was harder than anyone had anticipated. The heat was oppressive, reaching into the 90s Fahrenheit during July and August. Men unused to such temperatures suffered heat exhaustion and dehydration. The primitive roads, churned to dust or mud depending on weather, made progress agonizingly slow. Disease began spreading through the crowded camps. Dysentery, typhus, and other illnesses that killed thousands before a single major battle was fought. The horses suffered even more than the men. They required enormous amounts of fodder, grain and hay that became increasingly scarce as the army penetrated deeper into Russia. Horses began dying by the thousands, collapsing in their traces from exhaustion, starvation, or disease. These deaths would prove catastrophic when winter came, and the army needed every horse to pull supply wagons and artillery through snow. You notice these problems, of course, but you're a common soldier, not a general. Your world consists of your immediate squad, your daily rations, your sore feet, your hope that tomorrow will bring the decisive battle that ends this campaign and lets everyone go home. You don't understand the strategic situation. You don't know that Napoleon's supply lines are already overstretched, that his army is shrinking daily from disease and desertion, that the Russians are deliberately drawing him deeper into a trap measured not in space but in coming winter. The army finally fought a major battle at Borodino in September, about 70 miles west of Moscow. It was one of the bloodiest single-day battles in history to that point, with perhaps 70,000 casualties between both armies. The French technically won. They held the battlefield when fighting ended, but the Russian army, though battered, remained intact and capable of further resistance. More importantly, the battle had cost Napoleon casualties he couldn't replace, and time he couldn't afford. Autumn was advancing. The nights were growing noticeably colder. Officers who understood Russian climate began expressing concerns about the calendar. But Napoleon pushed forward, convinced that occupying Moscow would force Russian surrender. The army entered Moscow in mid-September to find the city largely abandoned. The Russian military had withdrawn. The civilian population had mostly fled. And then, on the night of September 14th, fires broke out across the city. Whether set by Russian patriots determined to deny Napoleon his prize or by accident in the chaos of occupation remains debated. But the result was catastrophic. Moscow burned for 5 days, destroying perhaps 3/4 of the city, including most of the supplies the French army had hoped to capture. Imagine standing in Moscow's ruins in late September 1812, realizing that the great prize you'd marched 1,000 miles to capture was now just ash and rubble. The stone buildings, churches, palaces, government structures still stood, but the wooden houses that made up most of the city were gone. The food stores that should have fed the army through winter were destroyed. The shelter that could have housed hundreds of thousands of soldiers didn't exist. Napoleon waited in Moscow for 5 weeks, hoping the Tsar would negotiate, sending peace offers that went unanswered. But Alexander, safe in St. Petersburg, refused all communication. He understood that time was now his ally. Every day Napoleon remained in Moscow. Autumn advanced toward winter. Every day delayed meant worse conditions for the inevitable retreat. By mid-October, Napoleon could wait no longer. Winter was visibly approaching. Snow flurries had already occurred. The nights were freezing. The army needed to retreat while movement was still possible, while the men still had some strength, while there was any hope of reaching safety before the full Russian winter arrived. The retreat began on October 19, 1812. The army that left Moscow numbered perhaps 100,000 men, already reduced from the 600,000 who had invaded. Disease, desertion, battle casualties, and the simple attrition of the long advance had consumed 5/6 of the original force. But worse, so much worse, was yet to come. The first snows fell in early November, earlier and heavier than normal even for Russia. Temperature, which had been merely cold, plummeted into ranges that soldiers from France or Italy or southern Germany had never experienced. 0 degrees Fahrenheit, then 10 below, then 20 below, then colder still, reaching temperatures that seemed impossible to men who had grown up in temperate climates. You're wearing a uniform designed for European campaigning, not Arctic survival. Wool coat, wool trousers, linen shirt, leather boots, clothing that would be adequate for normal winter conditions but utterly insufficient for what you're experiencing. The wool offers some insulation when dry, but becomes heavy and useless when wet from snow or sweat. The boots, designed for marching on roads, fall apart in the constant freezing and thawing, leaving your feet exposed to cold that turns flesh black with frostbite. The army had no winter clothing because no one had planned for winter campaigning. Some soldiers tried to improvise, wrapping themselves in blankets taken from Russian homes, stuffing straw or hay inside their coats for insulation, wrapping their feet in rags when their boots disintegrated. But these desperate measures provided only minimal protection against cold that seemed to penetrate everything. The physical sensation of extreme cold is difficult to describe to anyone who hasn't experienced it. At first, there's pain, your exposed skin burning, your fingers and toes aching unbearably. You thrust your hands under your armpits, trying to preserve feeling in your fingers. You stamp your feet while marching, trying to maintain circulation. You pull your collar up and your hat down, trying to protect any exposed skin. But as the cold penetrates deeper, the pain gradually fades, replaced by numbness that's almost worse. You can't feel your toes anymore. Your fingers refuse to work properly, making it impossible to load your musket or even button your coat. Your face feels like a wooden mask, stiff and unresponsive. You know, dimly, that this numbness means frostbite, that tissue is dying, that you're losing parts of yourself to the cold. But you can't stop. Stopping means death. The army's horses, already weakened by the summer campaign, began dying in enormous numbers. Without horses, wagons had to be abandoned. Without wagons, supplies disappeared. Food, ammunition, medical equipment, tents, everything that might have made survival possible. Artillery pieces, which had required teams of horses to pull, were abandoned beside the road when the horses died and no replacements existed, the cavalry, which had been Napoleon's elite strike force, essentially ceased to exist. Cavalrymen became infantry, trudging through snow on foot alongside everyone else. The magnificent French cavalry, which had charged across European battlefields for a decade, was reduced to frozen men in tattered uniforms, leading skeletal horses that could barely walk, let alone carry riders. Food became the army's obsession and greatest scarcity. The supply system had completely broken down. Foraging was nearly impossible. The countryside had been stripped during the advance, and now was buried under snow. The men were reduced to eating their horses when the animals died, fighting over carcasses, cutting meat from frozen bodies with whatever tools they possessed. Imagine the desperation of being so hungry that horse meat, stringy, tough, barely edible even in the best circumstances, seems like a feast. You and your companions gather around a dead horse, using bayonets and knives to hack chunks from the frozen carcass. There's no possibility of cooking it properly. You might hold pieces near a fire if you can get one started, might achieve something between frozen and raw, but mostly you just eat it as it is, because you need food and nothing else is available. Some soldiers, maddened by hunger and cold, committed acts that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. There were reports of cannibalism, of men so desperate they consumed the flesh of dead comrades. Whether these reports were accurate or exaggerated by horror and rumour is impossible to verify, but their mere existence speaks to the absolute depths of desperation the retreat had reached. The Russian winter was attacking in multiple ways simultaneously. The cold itself was killing men through hypothermia and frostbite. Hunger was weakening those who might otherwise have survived the cold. Disease continued spreading through the weakened, crowded army. Typhus particularly, transmitted by lice that infested everyone's clothing and thrived in the filthy conditions. And the Russians, both regular army and Cossack irregulars, harassed the retreating column constantly. They didn't need to fight major battles. They simply picked off stragglers, attacked supply wagons, descended on anyone who fell behind the main column. A soldier who stopped to rest, who couldn't keep pace, who stumbled and fell, would likely never rise again, either frozen to death or killed by pursuing Cossacks who gave no quarter to the invaders. The psychological impact of the retreat was as devastating as the physical suffering. Soldiers watched their companions die in enormous numbers, dozens or hundreds every day, and knew they would likely join them soon. The normal social bonds that held military units together, loyalty to comrades, obedience to officers, faith in the cause, dissolved under the strain. Men became focused purely on individual survival, willing to abandon wounded friends, to steal from dying comrades, to commit any act that might extend their own lives by even a few hours. Officers lost control of their units. Discipline evaporated. The Grande Armée, which had been one of history's most effective military organizations, became a disorganized mob of freezing, starving men simply trying to move west, trying to reach Poland or Prussia or anywhere warmer than this frozen hell. Napoleon himself, though he suffered less than his soldiers, he had better clothing, better shelter, better food, witnessed the destruction of his army with growing desperation. He had built this force over years, had led it to victories across Europe, had believed it invincible. Now it was dissolving before his eyes, consumed by an enemy he couldn't fight. Cold itself, winter itself, the Russian climate that killed more effectively than any human army could. The crossing of the Berezina River in late November became one of the campaign's most desperate moments. Russian forces had destroyed the bridges, and the river, though starting to freeze, wasn't yet solid enough to cross on ice. French engineers, working in freezing water that killed many of them within hours from hypothermia, somehow constructed 2 temporary bridges. The army crossed in chaos, under Russian artillery fire, with soldiers pushing and fighting to get across, with wagons and artillery abandoned on the eastern bank, with wounded left behind because there was no way to transport them. Thousands died in the crossing, drowned in the icy river, killed by Russian shells, crushed in the panic as the bridges threatened to collapse under the weight of desperate humanity. Those who made it across were in scarcely better condition than those left behind. The army that emerged from the Berezina crossing numbered perhaps 40,000 still-armed soldiers, capable of any military function, plus an unknown number of unarmed stragglers who had lost their weapons or were too weak to fight. Temperature continued dropping as December arrived. 40 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, 50 below. Temperatures at which exposed flesh freezes in minutes, at which breathing the air feels like inhaling knives, at which normal human activity becomes nearly impossible. You're still somehow alive, though you're not sure how. You've lost feeling in your feet weeks ago. They're black with frostbite, probably gangrenous, but you keep walking because stopping means death. Your hands are similarly damaged, fingers frozen into claws that barely function. Your face is covered with frost and sores. Your uniform is in rags, supplemented with whatever you've been able to scavenge from dead comrades. You haven't eaten a full meal in weeks. You can't remember the last time you felt warm, but you keep walking, one foot in front of the other, west, always west, toward home, toward warmth, toward life. The column around you is lined with corpses, thousands of frozen bodies marking the route. You don't look at them anymore. You don't think about them. You don't think about much of anything except the next step, and the step after that, and somehow making it through one more night. Nighttime was particularly deadly. Temperature dropped even further after dark. Men who stopped to sleep often never woke. They simply froze to death in their sleep. So you learned to sleep while walking, a kind of half-consciousness, where your body continued moving while your mind retreated into something like rest. You learned to recognize when companions were about to fall and not get up, learned to judge who might survive another day and who was already effectively dead. The survivors who finally staggered across the border into Prussia and Poland in December were barely recognizable as soldiers. Frostbitten, starving, diseased, dressed in rags, more dead than alive, they represented perhaps 1 in 50 of the men who had invaded Russia 6 months earlier. Of the 600,000 who had marched east in June, fewer than 10,000 returned as organized military units. Perhaps another 30 to 40,000 stragglers would eventually make their way back over subsequent weeks and months. The rest, 550,000 men give or take, were dead. Most hadn't died in battle. They'd frozen to death, starved to death, succumbed to disease, or been killed while too weak to defend themselves. They died in one of history's greatest military catastrophes, a disaster caused primarily not by enemy action but by cold itself. The Russian campaign destroyed Napoleon's aura of invincibility. The army that had conquered Europe had been consumed by winter. The emperor who had seemed unstoppable had been defeated by climate and distance. Within 2 years, Napoleon would abdicate for the first time. Within 3 years, he would be defeated finally at Waterloo. The frozen corpses littering the road from Moscow to the Polish border marked not just the end of an army but the beginning of the end of Napoleon's empire. But beyond the grand strategic implications, the 1812 campaign revealed something profound about the limits of human endurance and the absolute indifference of nature to human ambition. Napoleon had conquered nations, had defeated armies, had redrawn the map of Europe. But he couldn't conquer winter. He couldn't defeat cold. His soldiers, however brave and disciplined, couldn't survive temperatures that exceeded human tolerances regardless of courage or determination. The few who did survive carried the memories of that winter for the rest of their lives. They had experienced suffering at the extremes of what humans can endure. They had watched friends freeze to death, had abandoned wounded comrades because helping them meant dying alongside them, had committed acts of desperation and selfishness that haunted them forever. One survivor, a French officer named Philippe Paul de Ségur, wrote a memoir years later describing the retreat. His account, while sometimes embellished for dramatic effect, captured the essential horror of the experience. He wrote of men who gave up, who simply sat down in the snow and waited for death because continuing seemed more terrible than dying. He wrote of soldiers who went mad from suffering, who wandered away from the column into the frozen wilderness. He wrote of the unbearable cold, the constant hunger, the numbing exhaustion that made every step an agony. But de Ségur also wrote about moments of humanity that persisted even in that frozen hell. Soldiers who shared their last scraps of food with companions, officers who refused to abandon their men even when doing so might have saved their own lives. Friendships that deepened through shared suffering. Small acts of kindness and courage that reminded men they were still human, despite circumstances that seemed designed to reduce them to animals. These glimpses of humanity amid catastrophe suggest something important about human nature. We're capable of both terrible cruelty and remarkable compassion, often simultaneously. Extreme suffering can bring out the worst in us: selfishness, brutality, the pure survival instinct that overrides all other considerations. But it can also bring out the best: sacrifice, loyalty, determination to help others even at cost to ourselves. The survivors who made it home faced years of recovery, both physical and psychological. Many had lost fingers, toes, entire feet or hands to frostbite. Many suffered permanent health damage from starvation and disease. Many carried psychological scars that never fully healed. Nightmares about the frozen retreat, survivors' guilt about companions who hadn't made it, inability to feel warm even on summer days because some part of them was forever back in that Russian winter. But they also carried forward certain kinds of knowledge and wisdom earned through suffering. They understood viscerally what many people never learn: that comfort and security are never guaranteed, that circumstances can change catastrophically, that survival itself is an achievement worth celebrating. They had learned what the human body and spirit could endure, had discovered reserves of strength they'd never known they possessed, had survived experiences that should have killed them. As the decades passed and the survivors aged, the 1812 campaign became legendary. Veterans of the retreat were respected, almost revered, for having endured what seemed unendurable. They gathered on anniversaries to remember fallen comrades, to tell stories of survival, to honor the memory of the 600,000 who had marched east and the 550,000 who had never returned. These gatherings served important psychological functions. They provided communities of understanding. Only those who had experienced the retreat could truly comprehend what it had been like. They created spaces for grief and remembrance. They allowed survivors to find meaning in experiences that might otherwise seem purely tragic, transforming individual suffering into shared history that future generations could learn from. The lessons of 1812 influenced military thinking for generations. Future commanders studied the campaign as a cautionary tale about logistics, about the dangers of overextended supply lines, about the foolishness of underestimating climate and geography. The retreat became synonymous with military disaster, a reference point for catastrophic failure that entered common language. But beyond military history, the 1812 campaign offers insights about human resilience and the relationship between humans and environment. Napoleon's army failed not because the soldiers were cowardly or incompetent. They were among the best trained, most experienced troops in the world. They failed because they encountered conditions that exceeded human capacity to survive without adequate preparation and equipment. This reveals both human limitations and human adaptability. We're vulnerable to extreme cold in ways that don't respond to courage or determination. No amount of willpower can prevent frostbite when tissue is exposed to 50 below temperatures. No amount of discipline can stop starvation when food simply isn't available. We're physical beings with physical needs and physical limitations that can't be overcome through mental strength alone. Yet humans are also remarkably adaptable. Some soldiers survived conditions that killed most of their companions, found ways to preserve body heat, found food where others found none, maintained enough physical strength to keep walking when others collapsed. This wasn't just luck. It involved countless small decisions and actions that increased survival chances, knowledge about cold weather survival that some possessed and others lacked, physical conditioning and mental resilience that made the difference between life and death. The Russian peasants who lived in the regions the French army crossed possessed this knowledge through cultural inheritance and lived experience. They knew how to dress for extreme cold, how to build shelters that retained heat, how to find food in winter landscapes, how to recognize and treat frostbite. Their survival through Russian winters year after year demonstrated that humans could live in such climates, but only with proper knowledge, preparation, and equipment. Napoleon's soldiers lacked all three. They had no winter clothing, no knowledge of cold weather survival, no preparation for the conditions they encountered. Their catastrophic losses demonstrated what happens when humans challenge environments they don't understand and can't adapt to quickly enough. As you settle deeper into sleep tonight, perhaps you can draw both caution and comfort from this history. Caution because it reminds us that nature remains powerful and dangerous, that overconfidence in our abilities can lead to catastrophe, that some challenges require preparation and respect rather than just courage and determination, but also comfort because it demonstrates that even the most terrible experiences eventually end, that humans can survive conditions that seem unsurvivable, that the frozen hell of 1812 eventually gave way to spring and recovery, that most of those who survived went on to build meaningful lives despite their trauma. The soldiers who froze on the road from Moscow carried no great philosophical insights with them to their deaths. They were just young men who wanted to go home, who missed their families, who wished they'd never left their villages for this disastrous adventure. Their deaths weren't meaningful or redemptive or part of some grand plan. They were just tragic. The waste of hundreds of thousands of lives for a campaign that achieved nothing except demonstration of what happens when human ambition encounters natural forces it can't control. But the few who survived, who made it home despite everything, proved that survival is possible even through the worst catastrophes. They demonstrated that the human body and spirit can endure extraordinary suffering and still recover, can face death repeatedly and still choose life, can witness the destruction of everything familiar and still find reasons to continue. Their resilience wasn't superhuman. They were ordinary people who found themselves in extraordinary circumstances and somehow discovered within themselves the strength to keep walking, keep breathing, keep hoping for one more day, and then another, until finally, impossibly, they reach safety. This is perhaps the ultimate lesson of the 1812 retreat, that ordinary humans possess remarkable capacities for endurance when circumstances demand it, that survival itself is an achievement worth celebrating, that the worst experiences eventually end even when they seem eternal. So rest now, warm and safe, knowing that you're stronger than you imagine, more resilient than you believe, capable of surviving challenges that would seem impossible until you face them. The soldiers who froze in Russia demonstrated both human vulnerability and human strength, our limitations and our remarkable capacity to endure. The winter of 1812 was the coldest in memory, perhaps the coldest in centuries. It killed an army. It destroyed an empire's invincibility. It changed European history. But it also ended, as all winters do, giving way to spring and renewal and the continuation of life despite catastrophic losses. Sleep peacefully tonight and dream of spring following winter, of survival after catastrophe, of warmth returning after cold, of dawn breaking after the longest night. The frozen retreat happened 2 centuries ago, but its lessons remain eternal, about the power of nature, about human limits, about the resilience that allows us to survive and rebuild after even the most devastating disasters. Rest now, and trust that whatever challenges tomorrow brings, you carry within yourself the same strength that sustained those few survivors through impossible cold, through starvation and suffering, through the loss of everything except the stubborn determination to take one more step toward home, toward warmth, toward life. The retreat from Moscow ended. Spring came, life continued, and so it always does, carried forward by ordinary people who find extraordinary strength when circumstances demand it, who survive what seems unsurvivable, who endure what seems unbearable, and who demonstrate daily that the human spirit, however tested, possesses depths of resilience that can sustain us through any winter, however cold, however long, however dark. The aftermath of the 1812 campaign extended far beyond the immediate survivors and their families. The disaster sent shockwaves through European society, transforming how people understood warfare, leadership, and the relationship between human ambition and natural forces. The frozen corpses littering the Russian landscape became symbols not just of military defeat, but of hubris punished, of the terrible price paid when leaders ignore the fundamental realities of geography and climate. In France, the news of the catastrophe arrived gradually through the winter of 1812 and early 1813. Napoleon had left the remnants of his army in December, racing ahead to Paris to manage the political crisis he knew would follow. He arrived in the capital before most people understood the scale of the disaster, and immediately began managing information, controlling the narrative, attempting to minimize the political damage. But the truth couldn't be hidden for long. Survivors trickled back to their homes across Europe, not just France but Italy, Germany, Poland, all the nations that had contributed troops to the invasion. The reality became undeniable. Entire regiments had been annihilated. Towns that had sent hundreds of young men to Russia received back perhaps a dozen survivors. Families waited for sons and fathers and brothers who would never return, whose bodies lay frozen in mass graves along Russian roads or scattered across snow-covered fields. Imagine being a mother in a village in southern France, waiting through the winter for news of your son. You'd sent him off in the spring of 1812, barely 20 years old, so proud of his uniform, so excited for the adventure. Letters had arrived through the summer and autumn. Brief notes saying he was well, the army was advancing, Moscow would fall soon and then he'd come home. But then the letters stopped. Winter passed with no word. Spring arrived, and you began to see other soldiers returning, survivors who straggled back to the village in ones and twos, barely recognizable, missing fingers or toes or limbs to frostbite, haunted and changed by what they'd experienced. You asked each one if they'd seen your son, if they knew anything about his regiment, if they had any information at all. Some remembered him vaguely. Yes, he'd been alive at Moscow, or someone thought they'd seen him during the retreat. But no one knew for certain what had happened to him. He was simply gone, one of hundreds of thousands who had vanished into the Russian winter, neither confirmed dead nor alive, leaving you in a terrible uncertainty that might never resolve. This experience, multiplied across thousands of communities throughout Europe, created a collective trauma that shaped an entire generation. The losses were so massive, so sudden, so seemingly pointless, that they challenged basic assumptions about war, glory, and national service. Young men had marched off expecting adventure and returned as broken invalids or didn't return at all, their lives wasted in a campaign that achieved nothing. The cultural impact manifested in various ways. Romantic literature and art, which had often glorified war and military heroism, began exploring darker themes: the suffering of common soldiers, the gap between propaganda and reality, the ironic contrast between grand strategic objectives and individual human cost. Artists painted scenes of the retreat, frozen soldiers struggling through snow, abandoned wounded waiting for death, horses dying in their traces. These images, while sometimes melodramatic, captured real horrors that veterans recognized. Music reflected the shift as well. Funeral marches and requiems proliferated. Compositions exploring themes of loss, mourning, and the vanity of human ambition found ready audiences among populations grieving enormous casualties. Even folk songs and popular ballads took on darker tones, telling stories of soldiers who never came home, of villages emptied of their young men, of the bitter price of Napoleon's ambitions. The medical community grappled with understanding and treating the injuries survivors brought home. Frostbite on the scale seen after the Russian campaign was unprecedented in medical experience. Doctors struggled to treat gangrenous limbs, often resorting to amputation as the only option. They dealt with patients suffering from what we would now recognize as severe post-traumatic stress, nightmares, anxiety, inability to feel warm even in summer, panic at the sound of wind that reminded them of Russian blizzards. These treatments were primitive by modern standards. Psychological trauma wasn't well understood. Soldiers were expected to simply recover from their experiences through willpower and time. Physical injuries were treated with techniques that often caused more harm than good. Many survivors spent the rest of their lives as invalids, unable to work, dependent on family or meagre military pensions, their potential futures destroyed by those months in Russia. The economic impact of losing so many young men rippled through European societies for decades. Agriculture suffered from labour shortages. Families lost primary breadwinners. The tax base shrank as productive workers died or returned too disabled to work. Some regions took a generation or more to recover economically from the population losses, but there were also unexpected economic consequences. The massive demand for prosthetic limbs created a new industry. Craftsmen who had made wooden implements adapted their skills to creating artificial legs, feet, arms, and hands for amputees. These devices were crude by modern standards, simple wooden pegs or hooks, but they allowed some veterans to regain partial function and resume productive lives. Charitable organizations emerged to support veterans and their families. Some were government-sponsored, though state resources were limited and pensions often inadequate. Others were private initiatives, funded by wealthy individuals or religious organizations, attempting to provide relief that official channels couldn't manage. These charitable efforts, while unable to fully address the scale of need, represented early forms of social welfare systems that would gradually develop over subsequent decades. The political consequences of the disaster proved equally profound. Napoleon's other enemies, sensing weakness, formed a new coalition against France. The German states that had been reluctant French allies began defecting. Austria, which had contributed troops to the Russian campaign, switched sides. By autumn 1813, Napoleon faced enemies on multiple fronts, trying to defend France with armies rebuilt from teenagers and old men since the experienced soldiers had frozen in Russia. The campaign of 1813-1814, which eventually forced Napoleon's first abdication, might have turned out very differently if the Grande Armée hadn't been destroyed in Russia. The 600,000 men who marched east in 1812 represented the core of French military power. Their loss left Napoleon unable to defend his empire adequately, unable to replace such massive casualties quickly enough to resist the coalition forming against him. So the frozen retreat that began in Moscow in October 1812 ultimately led to Napoleon's fall in April 1814, to his exile on Elba, to the brief restoration of the Bourbon monarchy, and eventually to the final campaign of 1815 that ended at Waterloo. The cold that killed hundreds of thousands of soldiers also killed Napoleon's empire, demonstrating how environmental factors can determine political outcomes as surely as any battle. The survivors who had experienced the retreat found their perspectives on life fundamentally altered. Many had faced death repeatedly, had survived when companions died beside them, had made it through experiences that should have killed them. This created a complex psychology. Gratitude for survival mixed with guilt about being alive when so many others had died. Appreciation for ordinary comforts mixed with inability to fully enjoy them. Understanding of how fragile life was mixed with determination to make the most of however much time remained. Some veterans struggled to reintegrate into civilian life. How could you return to farming or shopkeeping after what you'd experienced? How could ordinary concerns, crops and weather and local gossip seem important after you'd watched your best friend freeze to death in your arms? How could you care about village politics or business disputes when you'd learned that none of it ultimately mattered? That death could take anyone at any moment regardless of their plans or concerns? This alienation from normal civilian life affected many combat veterans, but seemed particularly acute among survivors of the Russian campaign. They'd experienced something so far beyond ordinary human experience that sharing it with those who hadn't been there became impossible. When they tried to describe the cold, the hunger, the endless march through snow past thousands of frozen corpses, they saw incomprehension or disbelief in listeners' eyes. Eventually, many simply stopped trying keeping their memories private, finding comfort only among fellow survivors who understood without needing explanation. Yet some veterans found ways to create meaning from their experiences. They became advocates for military reform, arguing that soldiers deserved better treatment, better preparation, better leadership than what had led to the Russian disaster. They wrote memoirs and histories, attempting to record what had happened so future generations might learn from it. They served as cautionary voices against military adventurism, living reminders of where unchecked ambition could lead. The Russian campaign also affected how the Russian people understood themselves and their relationship with their vast, harsh homeland. The victory over Napoleon became a defining moment in Russian national identity, proof that Russia, however backward or primitive by Western European standards, possessed strengths that more civilized nations lacked. The Russian winter, which had destroyed the Grande Armée, became a symbol of national power, a weapon unique to Russia that made the country unconquerable. This interpretation wasn't entirely accurate. Russian military forces had contributed significantly to defeating Napoleon, and the campaign had been costly for Russia as well, with enormous destruction across the western regions and substantial Russian casualties. But the narrative of General Winter defeating Napoleon proved emotionally satisfying and politically useful, so it became the dominant story, repeated in histories and literature and popular culture. Russian generals in subsequent conflicts would sometimes invoke the spirit of 1812, reminding troops that Russia had defeated the greatest military genius of the age through determination, sacrifice, and willingness to endure hardships that softer Western Europeans couldn't match. This narrative shaped Russian military culture for generations, contributing to tactical and strategic approaches that emphasized mass over precision, endurance over efficiency, willingness to accept casualties that Western armies would find unacceptable. The environmental factors that contributed to the Grande Armée's destruction became subjects of study for military planners and scientists. What exactly had the temperatures been? How did extreme cold affect human physiology? What kinds of clothing and equipment would enable soldiers to operate in such conditions? These questions led to systematic research into cold weather survival, into understanding how human bodies responded to extreme temperatures, into developing better protection against environmental hazards. This research had applications beyond military contexts. Polar exploration, which accelerated in the 19th century, benefited from better understanding of cold weather survival, developed partly in response to the 1812 catastrophe. Arctic and Antarctic expeditions used clothing designs and survival techniques refined through studying what had gone wrong in Russia and what had allowed the few survivors to make it through. The psychological study of how humans respond to extreme stress also advanced partly through examining veteran experiences. Though the terminology and theoretical frameworks were primitive by modern standards, early psychiatrists and psychologists began recognizing patterns in how trauma affected people, how some individuals proved more resilient than others, how social support and meaning-making could facilitate recovery from horrible experiences. As decades passed and the generation that had experienced the campaign aged and died, the 1812 retreat transitioned from living memory to history. The last veterans died in the 1870s and 1880s, taking their direct experiences with them. What remained were written accounts, paintings and illustrations, monuments and memorials, and the collective memory embedded in national cultures. In Russia, the victory over Napoleon became mythologized in ways that increasingly departed from historical accuracy. The war became the Patriotic War of 1812, a national struggle where all of Russian society united to resist foreign invasion. This narrative minimized uncomfortable facts: that some Russians had welcomed Napoleon initially, that the campaign had devastated Western Russia, that victory had come at enormous cost. In France, the campaign became a tragedy to be mourned, but also sometimes romanticized. Napoleon's genius had been undone by circumstances beyond his control: the Russian winter, the vastness of the country, the barbarity of enemies who burned their own cities rather than surrender. This interpretation minimized Napoleon's strategic errors: invading too late in the campaign season, inadequate logistical preparation, refusing to withdraw from Moscow soon enough, in favor of depicting him as a tragic hero defeated by fate rather than his own mistakes. In Germany, Poland, Italy, and other nations that had contributed troops, the campaign became part of complex national narratives about their relationships with France, with Russia, with military service and national identity. Polish troops had fought hoping that supporting Napoleon might lead to restoration of Polish independence. Their losses in Russia, where perhaps 60,000 Poles had served and fewer than 10,000 returned, became tragic chapters in Poland's long struggle for nationhood. These various national narratives, while often conflicting with each other and sometimes with historical evidence, served important functions. They helped societies process collective trauma. They provided frameworks for understanding catastrophic losses. They created meaning from experiences that might otherwise seem purely tragic and pointless. The physical landscape where the campaign occurred retained traces of the catastrophe for decades. Mass graves dotted the route of the retreat, shallow pits where frozen corpses had been piled by the hundreds or thousands, covered with minimal earth. As decades passed and weather and natural processes did their work, these graves occasionally revealed their contents. Farmers ploughing fields would turn up bones, buttons, bits of uniform, rusted weapons. In some areas, particularly around major battle sites and river crossings where deaths had been especially concentrated, the ground remained disturbed for generations. Local residents developed folklore about the sites, stories of ghosts walking the old retreat route, of voices heard on winter nights, of cursed ground where crops wouldn't grow properly. Whether these stories had any basis beyond imagination and cultural memory is impossible to determine, but their existence demonstrates how deeply the campaign had marked the landscape and the collective consciousness of those who lived there. By the late 19th century, as European powers engaged in new wars and new catastrophes, the 1812 campaign began to be re-evaluated by military historians and strategists. The initial tendency had been to view it as an aberration, a unique disaster caused by unique circumstances that offered few lessons for future warfare. But as military thinking became more sophisticated, analysts began extracting broader principles. The importance of logistics and supply lines received new emphasis. Napoleon's failure to adequately supply his massive army offered lessons about the relationship between force size and sustainability, about the dangers of outrunning supply capabilities, about the need to prepare for worst-case scenarios rather than assuming best-case outcomes. The role of environmental factors in military operations gained recognition. Weather, climate, terrain, season. All these factors that Napoleon had underestimated or ignored proved capable of determining campaign outcomes as surely as troop numbers or tactical brilliance. Future planners began factoring environmental considerations more systematically into operational planning. The limits of what soldiers could endure, even with excellent training and discipline, became clearer. The Grande Armée had included some of history's finest troops, veterans of dozens of campaigns, led by experienced officers, organized in sophisticated tactical formations. Yet they'd been destroyed by cold and hunger because human bodies have absolute limits that can't be overcome through training or willpower alone. When World War I erupted in 1914, bringing industrialized warfare to Europe on an unprecedented scale, some commentators invoked memories of 1812 as a cautionary precedent. The hubris of leaders who thought they could control events, the gap between strategic plans and brutal realities, the massive casualties among common soldiers, all echoed the earlier disaster, though in very different circumstances. The Eastern Front of World War I, where German and Austro-Hungarian forces fought Russia, across many of the same regions the Grande Armée had traversed, brought new relevance to the 1812 experience. Soldiers in 1914-1918 faced different tactical situations but similar environmental challenges: the vast distances, the primitive infrastructure, the brutal winters. Some units kept copies of memoirs from 1812 veterans, studying them for insights into cold weather survival and operations in the Russian environment. World War II brought even more direct parallels. When Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, historians immediately recognized echoes of Napoleon's campaign. The initial rapid advance, the difficulty of supplying forces across vast distances, the Red Army's strategic retreats, the onset of winter catching German forces unprepared, all replicated patterns from 1812, though on even larger scale with modern weapons and even greater casualties. The German military leadership was certainly aware of the 1812 precedent. Hitler explicitly invoked it, insisting that modern mechanized warfare and German superiority would prevent any repetition. His generals were less confident, particularly as autumn 1941 arrived and Soviet resistance continued while German forces remained hundreds of miles from complete victory. When winter arrived and German soldiers, equipped for summer campaigning, began suffering from cold in temperatures they weren't prepared for, the parallels became impossible to ignore. The ultimate failure of the German invasion of the Soviet Union, like Napoleon's campaign before it, demonstrated that some lessons require repeated, painful relearning. The vastness of Russia, the harshness of the climate, the resilience of the population, the difficulty of sustaining long-distance offensives, all these factors that had destroyed the Grande Armée proved equally capable of destroying the Wehrmacht, despite 130 years of technological advancement and supposed progress in military science. In both cases, initial success and rapid advances created overconfidence. In both cases, leaders underestimated both the enemy and the environment. In both cases, soldiers paid with their lives for their commanders' miscalculations, and in both cases, winter proved an impartial, merciless enemy that killed without regard for nationality, ideology, or individual character. As you drift deeper into sleep, perhaps these repeated patterns offer paradoxical comfort. Human folly persists across generations. We make the same mistakes repeatedly, failing to learn lessons that history teaches clearly. This is sobering and tragic, yet it also confirms that you're part of a flawed, struggling species that has always made mistakes and always will, that perfection isn't required for survival, that humanity endures despite regular catastrophic failures. The soldiers who froze on the retreat from Moscow in 1812, and those who froze in similar circumstances 130 years later, were victims of decisions they didn't make, forced to suffer consequences of strategies they didn't design. Yet many of them showed extraordinary courage and resilience, maintaining their humanity in circumstances designed to destroy it, helping comrades even when self-preservation argued for abandonment, continuing to hope and struggle even when hope seemed irrational. Their resilience across different eras and different political systems suggests that these qualities, determination, mutual support, refusal to surrender even when defeat seems certain, represent fundamental human capacities that transcend particular historical circumstances. Whether you're a French conscript in 1812, or a German soldier in 1941, or anyone facing seemingly impossible challenges, you have access to the same basic human strengths that have sustained people through history's worst catastrophes. The specific details change: the weapons, the politics, the technology, the ideologies, but the fundamental human experience of facing overwhelming difficulty, of choosing between survival and surrender, of discovering unexpected reserves of strength, of enduring what seems unendurable, these remain constant across time and culture. So as you settle into rest tonight, know that you're connected to all those who came before, who faced their own versions of winter and cold and impossible challenges. Their experiences, preserved in memoirs and histories and collective memory, offer evidence that humans can survive extraordinary hardships, that the worst experiences eventually end, that spring follows even the cruelest winter. The retreat from Moscow ended in December 1812. The survivors made it home, however damaged. Europe recovered from the catastrophe. Life continued as it always does, carried forward by ordinary people who refuse to let catastrophe have the final word, who rebuild after destruction, who maintain hope despite every reason for despair. In the quiet moments before sleep claims you completely, perhaps you can imagine yourself not as one of the frozen corpses littering the Russian landscape, but as one of the survivors, exhausted, damaged, transformed by suffering, but alive and moving forward toward home and warmth and whatever future awaits. This isn't denial of tragedy or minimization of suffering. It's recognition that most people, most of the time, do survive their trials, however difficult, and that survival itself is worth celebrating. The coldest winter eventually ends. The spring eventually comes. The frozen ground eventually thaws. And life, however damaged or changed, eventually recovers and continues. This is history's promise and humanity's achievement, that we endure, we adapt, we survive, we rebuild, we continue, despite everything that conspires against us. Rest now in that knowledge. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges, but you possess within yourself the same fundamental human resilience that sustained soldiers through the Russian winter, that enabled survivors to rebuild their lives, that has carried humanity through countless catastrophes across countless generations. The cold was real. The suffering was real. The deaths were real. But so was the survival, the resilience, the continuation. And in that continuation lies all of human hope, that we are capable of enduring more than we imagine, surviving what seems unsurvivable, finding strength we didn't know we possessed when circumstances demand it. Sleep peacefully now, and dream of warmth returning after cold, of life persisting after death, of spring following winter in the eternal cycle that has sustained humanity since the beginning and will continue far beyond our individual lives. The retreat from Moscow is history, but its lessons remain timeless. We are vulnerable but resilient, limited but adaptable, mortal but enduring, and that combination of fragility and strength defines the human condition across all times and places. The legacy of the 1812 campaign extended into unexpected areas of human knowledge and cultural development that wouldn't become apparent for decades after the last veteran had died. The disaster became a touchstone for understanding not just military history, but human psychology, physiology, leadership, decision-making under uncertainty, and the complex relationship between human ambition and natural limits. Medical researchers in the mid-19th century began systematically studying the physiological effects of extreme cold, building on observations recorded by surgeons who had accompanied Napoleon's army. These early accounts, written under terrible conditions by doctors who were themselves suffering from cold and hunger, nevertheless contained valuable observations about how the human body responded to sustained exposure to sub-zero temperatures. One surgeon, Baron Dominique Jean Larrey, who served as Napoleon's chief medical officer, kept detailed notes throughout the campaign despite the chaos around him. He documented the progression of frostbite, noting how tissue first became pale and numb, then darkened through various stages until it turned black and gangrenous. He observed that soldiers who kept moving survived longer than those who stopped to rest, that wet clothing accelerated heat loss dramatically, that alcohol, contrary to popular belief, actually increased vulnerability to cold by dilating blood vessels and accelerating heat loss, even as it created a temporary sensation of warmth. Larry's observations, along with those of other medical personnel, formed the foundation for systematic understanding of hypothermia and frostbite. Later researchers built on this foundation, conducting experiments to understand exactly how cold affected human physiology, what temperature ranges human beings could tolerate for what periods, how different protective measures affected survival rates, what treatments proved most effective for cold injuries. This knowledge saved lives in subsequent conflicts and explorations. Arctic expeditions in the late 19th and early 20th centuries used techniques derived partly from studying what had gone wrong in Russia and what had allowed some soldiers to survive. The development of proper cold weather clothing, layering systems, insulated boots, and other protective equipment drew on hard lessons learned through the suffering of Napoleon's army. The psychological dimensions of the retreat fascinated early psychiatrists and psychologists as these disciplines emerged in the later 19th century. Here was a natural experiment in human behavior under extreme stress. How did people respond when faced with almost certain death? What personality traits or behavioral patterns predicted survival? How did group dynamics change when normal social structures broke down? What coping mechanisms did survivors employ, and how did trauma affect them in subsequent years? Veterans' memoirs provided rich material for analysis. Some survivors had written detailed accounts of their experiences, describing not just external events, but their internal psychological states. The terror, the numbness, the occasional moments of calm acceptance, the fluctuating hope and despair, the gradual erosion of normal moral constraints, the surprising persistence of compassion and loyalty, even in desperate circumstances. One common theme in these accounts was the importance of having a reason to survive beyond mere self-preservation. Soldiers who focused solely on their own survival often didn't make it. They gave up when the suffering became too intense, when continuing seemed pointless. But those who felt responsibility to others, comrades depending on them, families waiting at home, duties they'd sworn to fulfill, often found strength to continue even when purely selfish calculation suggested surrender. This observation anticipated modern psychological research on resilience and meaning-making in extreme situations. Viktor Frankl, who survived Nazi concentration camps and later developed logotherapy, articulated similar principles, that humans can endure almost any suffering if they have a strong enough reason, that meaning and purpose sustain people through trials that pure survival instinct alone cannot overcome. The 1812 veterans who survived by maintaining connection to something beyond themselves, whether duty, love, loyalty, or simply stubborn refusal to let the cold claim them, demonstrated this principle generations before it was formally articulated. Their experiences suggested that psychological resilience isn't simply about individual toughness, but about maintaining connection to values and relationships that transcend immediate suffering. The economic historians who later studied the campaign's aftermath discovered fascinating patterns in how societies absorbed and adapted to catastrophic losses. The demographic impact of losing so many young men rippled through European economies for decades in complex ways. Some regions experienced labor shortages that drove up wages and improved conditions for surviving workers. Other regions struggled with reduced productivity and economic stagnation. The patterns weren't uniform or predictable. Some communities that lost large percentages of their young men nevertheless recovered quickly, developing new economic strategies, attracting migrants to fill empty positions, adapting to changed circumstances with remarkable flexibility. Other communities that suffered comparable losses languished for generations, unable to adapt, trapped in cycles of decline that the initial catastrophe had triggered, but that persisted long after the immediate crisis had passed. What distinguished resilient communities from those that failed to recover? The research suggested several factors. Communities with diverse economies adapted better than those dependent on single industries or crops. Communities with strong social institutions, churches, guilds, civic organizations that could coordinate collective responses fared better than those where social bonds were weak. Communities that maintained hope and forward-looking orientation recovered faster than those that became trapped in grief and nostalgia for what had been lost. These patterns had implications beyond the specific historical circumstances of post-1812 Europe. They suggested general principles about community resilience in the face of catastrophic losses, principles that remained relevant for communities facing natural disasters, economic collapses, epidemics, or other crises that destroyed existing structures and demanded adaptation to drastically changed circumstances. The military analysis of the campaign continued evolving through the 19th and 20th centuries as new theoretical frameworks emerged. Early analyses focused primarily on tactical and operational details, what battles were fought, what maneuvers were attempted, where Napoleon made specific decisions that proved disastrous. These analyses treated the campaign primarily as a military problem, as if better tactics or different decisions at key moments might have produced victory. But later analyses took broader views, examining the strategic context, the political objectives, the fundamental feasibility of the entire enterprise. Some historians argued that the campaign was doomed from conception, that no amount of tactical brilliance could have overcome the fundamental problems of distance, logistics, and climate. Russia was simply too vast, too poorly developed infrastructurally, too harsh environmentally for any early 19th century army to conquer and occupy successfully. This interpretation suggested that Napoleon's greatest error wasn't any specific tactical mistake, but the strategic decision to invade at all. He had allowed political frustration with Russian defiance of his continental system to override rational assessment of what was actually achievable. His previous successes had created overconfidence, belief that his military genius could overcome any obstacle, that the Grande Armée was invincible regardless of circumstances. This analysis of strategic overreach and the dangers of success breeding overconfidence became a standard cautionary tale in military education. Staff colleges around the world used the 1812 campaign as a case study in how brilliant leaders could make catastrophic errors when they lost touch with realistic assessment of constraints and possibilities, when they began believing their own propaganda about invincibility, when they confused tactical military capability with strategic political achievement. The cultural memory of the retreat took different forms in different national traditions, each shaped by particular political and social contexts. In France, the campaign became entangled with complex attitudes toward Napoleon himself. For monarchists and conservatives who opposed Napoleon, the Russian disaster was evidence of his recklessness and the tragic consequences of his ambition. For Republicans and liberals who saw Napoleon as a champion of revolutionary ideals despite his authoritarian methods, the disaster was tragic but didn't negate his achievements. French literature and art explored these tensions through various works that depicted the retreat. Some emphasized the heroism and suffering of common soldiers, victims of decisions beyond their control. Others focused on Napoleon himself, sometimes portraying him as a tragic hero undone by fate, sometimes as a cautionary figure whose hubris brought disaster. These varying interpretations reflected broader debates about Napoleon's legacy that continued in France for generations. In Russia, the campaign became mythologized as the Patriotic War, a defining moment of national unity and resistance against foreign invasion. This interpretation emphasized how all classes of Russian society, nobility, clergy, merchants, peasants, had united to resist Napoleon, how the Russian spirit had proved stronger than Western military technology and tactics, how Russia's vastness and harsh climate were national assets that made the country unconquerable. This mythology served important political purposes for Russian governments, both imperial and later Soviet. It provided a narrative of national strength and resilience, a founding myth for Russian national identity, a story that could be invoked to inspire unity during subsequent crises. When Nazi Germany invaded in 1941, Soviet propaganda immediately drew parallels to 1812, suggesting that just as Russia had defeated Napoleon, so it would defeat Hitler, that Russian resilience and winter would again destroy an arrogant invader. The accuracy of these mythologized versions of events mattered less than their emotional and political utility. Nations need founding stories, narratives that explain who they are and what makes them distinctive. For Russia, the defeat of Napoleon became such a story, repeated and elaborated through literature, music, art, and public commemoration, until it became inseparable from Russian national identity. Leo Tolstoy's novel War and Peace, published in the 1860s, represented perhaps the most sophisticated literary treatment of the 1812 campaign. Tolstoy, himself a veteran of the Crimean War and deeply interested in questions of history, leadership, and human agency, used the Napoleonic invasion as the backdrop for an epic exploration of how great events actually unfold, how individual human choices interact with vast historical forces, how leaders influence events far less than they imagine. Tolstoy's portrayal of the campaign emphasized chaos, contingency, and the limits of human control. Napoleon appeared not as a military genius, but as a man deluded about his own importance, issuing orders that had little effect on actual events, taking credit for outcomes he hadn't really controlled. The Russian commanders appeared equally confused, their strategies often ineffective, their victories as much products of circumstances beyond their control as of deliberate planning. The real story in Tolstoy's telling belonged to the countless individual human beings, soldiers, civilians, nobles, peasants, whose small decisions and actions, multiplied across hundreds of thousands of people, actually determined what happened. The French retreat wasn't primarily the result of Russian military strategy or Napoleon's errors, but of countless small failures and adaptations, of logistics breaking down, of soldiers making individual choices about whether to keep marching or give up, of weather and terrain and disease and accident creating conditions that no commander could fully control or predict. This interpretation challenged traditional ways of understanding history and war. It suggested that great leaders mattered less than historians typically assumed, that events emerged from complex interactions of countless factors rather than being determined by individual genius or error, that human agency was real but limited, operating within constraints imposed by geography, climate, logistics, and the accumulated weight of millions of small causes. Tolstoy's philosophical interpretation of the campaign influenced how subsequent generations understood not just 1812 specifically, but historical causation generally. His emphasis on complexity, contingency, and the limits of individual control anticipated modern systems thinking and complexity theory. His skepticism about great man theories of history contributed to more sophisticated historical analysis that examined structural factors, environmental constraints, and collective human behavior rather than focusing exclusively on leaders' decisions. The retreat's influence on Romantic art and literature extended beyond national traditions to shape broader European cultural movements. The image of the frozen retreat, suffering humanity dwarfed by vast snowy landscapes, the contrast between individual human vulnerability and nature's indifferent power, the tragic consequences of overreaching ambition, resonated with romantic sensibilities that emphasized emotion, sublime natural forces, and the limits of human reason. Artists painted dramatic scenes of the retreat, often emphasizing the landscape's terrible beauty and the pitiful smallness of human figures struggling through snow. These paintings captured the romantic fascination with the sublime, experiences that combined beauty with terror, that provoked awe through their depiction of forces beyond human scale or control. The cold itself became a kind of character in these artistic treatments, not merely environmental background, but an active, malevolent force pursuing and destroying the army. This personification of natural forces was characteristic of romantic approaches to nature, which rejected Enlightenment views of nature as mechanical and inert, instead depicting it as vital, powerful, sometimes hostile to human purposes. Musicians composed works inspired by the retreat, attempting to capture in sound the experience of suffering and endurance, the contrast between martial grandeur and ultimate catastrophe, the tragic arc from confident advance to desperate flight. Tchaikovsky's 1812 overture, though composed 7 decades after the events and intended primarily as patriotic Russian celebration, captured some of this dramatic trajectory, moving from ominous beginning through triumphant climax representing Russian victory. The retreat also influenced political thought in complex ways. For conservatives, it demonstrated the dangers of revolution and upheaval. Napoleon was, after all, a product of the French Revolution. and his disastrous ambition could be interpreted as showing where revolutionary ideals led when unrestrained by traditional institutions and moral limits. For liberals and progressives, the disaster offered different lessons. Some emphasized the suffering of common soldiers, using the campaign to critique militarism and aristocratic leadership that spent lives carelessly pursuing goals that served rulers rather than ordinary people. Others focused on Russian backwardness and autocracy, arguing that more advanced democratic societies would never suffer such losses because their governments would be more accountable to citizens and less likely to pursue reckless adventures. These varying political interpretations demonstrated how the same historical events could be used to support contradictory conclusions, depending on what aspects one emphasized and what larger frameworks one brought to the analysis. The 1812 campaign became a kind of Rorschach test, revealing interpreters' pre-existing political commitments as much as objective historical lessons. The technological lessons of the campaign influenced military development in sometimes unexpected ways. The destruction of cavalry through loss of horses led to increased emphasis on infantry in subsequent decades. The failure of artillery, which had to be abandoned when horses died and couldn't be moved, prompted thinking about lighter, more mobile artillery that wouldn't require as many horses. The supply difficulties encouraged development of better logistics systems, food preservation techniques, and transportation infrastructure. But perhaps the most important technological lesson was negative, the recognition that technology alone couldn't overcome fundamental environmental and logistical constraints. Napoleon's army had been equipped with the best weapons and equipment available in 1812. Their muskets, artillery, and cavalry were state-of-the-art for their era. Yet all this sophisticated military technology proved useless against cold and hunger. This suggested that military power had fundamental limits, that wars couldn't always be won through superior weapons or tactics, that environmental factors and basic human needs, food, warmth, shelter, mattered more than technological sophistication. These insights ran counter to the emerging industrial era faith in technology's ability to solve all problems, serving as reminders that humans remained vulnerable to natural forces regardless of technological advancement. The memoir literature produced by survivors continued growing for decades after the retreat, as veterans recorded their experiences for posterity. These accounts varied enormously in style, perspective, and reliability. Some were carefully researched attempts at historical accuracy, consulting maps and official records to verify dates and locations. Others were impressionistic, focusing on emotional and sensory experiences rather than factual precision. Some were probably embellished or even partially fictionalized as memory faded and dramatic storytelling temptations increased. Yet collectively, these memoirs provided invaluable perspectives on the retreat's human dimensions. They described what extreme cold actually felt like, how hunger affected thinking and behavior, what moral dilemmas people faced when forced to choose between helping others and saving themselves, how random chance determined who survived and who died. One common theme in many memoirs was the role of small kindnesses in sustaining morale and enabling survival. A comrade sharing a piece of bread when he barely had enough for himself. An officer refusing to abandon wounded men even when doing so slowed the retreat and increased his own danger. A stranger providing shelter for a night, risking punishment if discovered helping French soldiers. These small acts of compassion, set against the larger backdrop of mass death and suffering, took on enormous significance in survivors' memories. Another common theme was the importance of hope, however irrational. Soldiers who maintained belief that they would somehow survive, that they would make it home to see families again, that the suffering would eventually end, often found strength to continue when those who gave up hope simply sat down in the snow to die. This wasn't simply positive thinking. Many optimistic soldiers died while some pessimists survived through luck. But hope seemed to provide psychological resources that increased survival chances, giving people reasons to take one more step, endure one more night, resist the tempting ease of surrender. The memoirs also documented the breakdown of normal social hierarchies and rules under extreme stress. Officers lost authority as their ability to provide food or protection disappeared. Soldiers ignored orders when survival required it, scavenging and foraging independently rather than maintaining military discipline. Traditional distinctions between ranks meant little when everyone faced the same cold and hunger, when a private with a piece of bread was richer than a general with empty pockets. Yet interestingly, some structures and loyalties persisted even when formal authority collapsed. Soldiers often remained loyal to immediate comrades, to their squad or platoon, even when they ignored orders from higher command. Officers who had earned respect through competence and care for their men retained influence even when they lacked any power to enforce it. These informal bonds, based on trust and mutual dependence rather than formal rank, sometimes proved stronger than official military hierarchy. This suggested something important about human social organization, that formal authority structures depend ultimately on informal social bonds, on trust and legitimacy that must be continually earned rather than simply commanded, on reciprocal obligations rather than unilateral power. When circumstances became extreme enough to strip away formal structures, what remained were these fundamental human relationships, these basic patterns of cooperation and mutual support that appeared to be more fundamental than the official institutions built upon them. The spiritual and religious dimensions of the retreat received attention from theologians and religious historians interested in how extreme suffering affected faith. Some survivors' accounts described losing faith entirely. How could a benevolent God permit such suffering? How could religious teachings about divine justice make sense when good people died horrible deaths, while wicked people sometimes survived? These questions, similar to those raised by the Black Death centuries earlier, challenged comfortable religious assumptions about divine providence and moral order. Other accounts described faith intensifying during the retreat, providing psychological sustenance when material resources failed. Soldiers who prayed regularly, who maintained religious rituals even in impossible conditions, who interpreted their suffering through religious frameworks of testing or purification, sometimes found meaning and purpose that sustained them when purely secular motivations failed. The relationship between religious faith and survival proved complex and impossible to reduce to simple formulas. Some deeply religious soldiers died while atheists survived. Some lost faith as suffering continued while others found faith through their trials. What seemed clear was that humans sought meaning in suffering, needed frameworks for making sense of experiences that seemed senseless, wanted to believe that their anguish served some purpose beyond random cruelty. Religious faith provided such frameworks for some people, while others found meaning through loyalty to comrades, commitment to families waiting at home, or simple stubborn determination not to let circumstances defeat them. The specific content of these meaning-making frameworks varied, but the need for meaning itself appeared universal. Humans couldn't endure prolonged, intense suffering without believing it meant something, without constructing narratives that explained why they should continue rather than surrender. As the 19th century progressed into the 20th, and as new catastrophes overtook the 1812 campaign in public consciousness, the retreat began its transition from living memory to history to mythology. Each generation interpreted it through their own concerns and contexts, finding in it lessons and meanings relevant to their particular circumstances. For the generation that experienced World War I, the retreat offered precedents for understanding mass death, the destruction of armies through attrition, the gap between military plans and battlefield realities, the suffering of common soldiers in conflicts driven by political objectives they barely understood. The frozen retreat through Russia anticipated the muddy, frozen trenches of the Western Front, where different technology produced similar suffering. For those who lived through World War II, particularly the Soviet Great Patriotic War, the 1812 campaign provided inspiration and precedent. Soviet propaganda explicitly invoked the earlier defeat of Napoleon to predict ultimate victory over Nazi Germany. The parallels were obvious enough to be powerfully motivating. Both invasions had begun with rapid advances, both had underestimated Russian resistance and winter's severity. Both would ultimately fail despite initial successes. This use of historical memory for political and military purposes demonstrated how past catastrophes could be transformed into sources of hope and determination. The soldiers and civilians defending the Soviet Union in 1941-1945 drew strength from knowing their ancestors had defeated a previous invasion, from believing that Russian resilience and winter would again prove decisive, from trusting that however terrible current circumstances seemed, they would eventually triumph as their forebears had. Whether these beliefs were historically accurate mattered less than their psychological and political utility. History served not primarily as objective record of what happened, but as repository of stories and lessons that could be deployed to make sense of present circumstances and inspire future action. The retreat from Moscow was simultaneously historical fact and usable myth, both what actually happened and what people needed to believe had happened to find meaning in their own struggles. For Cold War-era analysts interested in strategic theory and nuclear deterrence, the 1812 campaign offered lessons about miscalculation, escalation, and the limits of military power. Napoleon had believed his superior forces could compel Russian surrender, that demonstrating military dominance would produce political results he desired. Instead, the military campaign destroyed his army while achieving none of his political objectives, a cautionary tale about assuming that military force automatically translates into political success. These lessons seemed relevant to nuclear-age strategists thinking about how to avoid catastrophic conflicts. The recognition that even overwhelming military superiority might not achieve desired political outcomes, that some countries might accept enormous damage rather than surrender, that wars could destroy both winners and losers. All these insights from 1812 remained pertinent in different contexts and with different technologies. As you continue drifting toward deeper sleep, perhaps these various interpretations and reinterpretations of the retreat offer a final insight about how humans understand and learn from catastrophes. We don't simply record what happened and extract objective lessons. We repeatedly revisit our disasters, finding in them new meanings relevant to changed circumstances, using them to make sense of present challenges, transforming them from simple past events into living parts of cultural memory that continue shaping how we think and act. The soldiers who froze in Russia in 1812 could not have imagined how their suffering would be remembered interpreted and reinterpreted by subsequent generations. They died trying to get home, trying to escape the cold, trying simply to survive one more day. Their immediate experiences were visceral and particular: frozen feet, empty stomachs, unbearable exhaustion, desperate fear. But their collective experience became something larger than individual suffering. It became a story about human limits and human resilience, about the dangers of hubris and the power of nature, about how catastrophes unfold and how survivors endure. It became source material for artists and writers, case study for military historians, inspiration for people facing their own trials, warning for leaders contemplating risky ventures. This transformation from experience to memory to history to myth doesn't diminish the reality of what happened. The soldiers still suffered and died. The cold was still unbearable. The catastrophe was still real. But their experience gained additional layers of meaning as it passed into collective memory and cultural inheritance. You are heir to this inheritance, connected across 2 centuries to those frozen soldiers through the simple fact of shared humanity. The challenges you face are different from theirs. You likely won't freeze to death on a Russian road. But you face your own versions of cold and hardship, your own trials that test your limits, your own moments when continuing seems impossibly difficult. In those moments, the example of the retreat survivors offers perspective and encouragement. If they could endure literal freezing, literal starvation, literal watching their companions die beside them, and still some survived and rebuilt lives afterward, then perhaps you can endure your challenges too. Their resilience becomes yours through this connection across time, their strength available to you as example and inspiration. The coldest winter eventually ended. The spring eventually came. The survivors eventually made it home and most eventually rebuilt meaningful lives despite their trauma. This pattern, catastrophe, endurance, survival, recovery, continuation, has repeated countless times throughout human history. It's happening now in various forms around the world. It will happen in your life too. The passage of time transformed how the survivors themselves understood their experiences. In the immediate aftermath during the first years after returning home, many veterans struggled simply to process what had happened to them. The memories were too raw, too painful, too overwhelming to integrate into coherent narratives. They existed as fragments, sensory flashes of unbearable cold, vivid images of dying friends, nightmares that jolted them awake, convinced they were still on that frozen road. But as years passed and the veterans aged, something shifted in how they related to their memories. The immediate visceral terror faded somewhat, replaced by different kinds of understanding. Men in their 40s and 50s, looking back on experiences they'd survived as young soldiers in their 20s, began seeing patterns and meanings that hadn't been visible during the events themselves. Some veterans described this process in their later writings. One French officer, writing in the 1840s, 3 decades after the retreat, reflected that only with time's distance could he appreciate what he and his companions had actually endured and achieved. At the time, survival had been purely instinctual. Put one foot ahead of the other, find food somehow, stay awake through the night, repeat. There was no space for reflection, no capacity for understanding the larger picture, no possibility of extracting meaning from experiences that consisted purely of moment-to-moment struggle. But decades later, safely removed from immediate danger, he could recognize the retreat as a defining experience that had shaped everything that followed. He had discovered capabilities he'd never known he possessed. He had witnessed both the worst and best of human nature. He had learned truths about life, death, suffering, and endurance that couldn't be learned any other way. These lessons, invisible during the actual events, had gradually revealed themselves over subsequent years, influencing his choices, his relationships, his understanding of what mattered and what didn't. This delayed understanding of traumatic experiences appears to be common across different contexts and eras. Survivors of catastrophes often can't fully process what happened to them until years afterward, when the immediate crisis has passed and they've achieved some psychological distance. The meanings and lessons emerge slowly, through repeated revisiting of memories, through conversations with fellow survivors, through the simple passage of time allowing perspective that's impossible during crisis itself. The veteran communities that formed among retreat survivors served crucial functions in this meaning-making process. When veterans gathered annually to commemorate the campaign, they weren't simply engaging in nostalgia or military pageantry. They were creating spaces where their experiences could be acknowledged, validated, and gradually integrated into coherent understandings. These gatherings allowed veterans to share stories with the only people who could truly understand them. A civilian who had never experienced military service, let alone the particular horrors of the Russian retreat, couldn't fully comprehend what veterans described. They might sympathize, might offer respect and gratitude, but they couldn't really know what it had been like. Only fellow survivors possessed that knowledge. So the veteran gatherings became places where men could speak freely about experiences they couldn't share elsewhere. They could describe the terror without being judged as cowardly. They could admit to moments of weakness or moral compromise without being condemned. They could express grief about lost comrades without being told to move on and forget. They could acknowledge that part of them remained forever on that frozen road, that they'd never fully returned from Russia, that the warm, comfortable present never completely displaced the cold, desperate past. These communities also served practical functions beyond psychological support. Veterans helped each other navigate the bureaucratic complexities of military pensions and disability benefits. They provided business connections and employment opportunities when possible. They looked after widows and orphans of men who had survived the retreat only to die in subsequent years. They created networks of mutual aid that substituted for inadequate official support systems. The children and grandchildren of retreat survivors inherited complex legacies from their veteran forebears. Some grew up hearing constant stories about the campaign, their childhoods saturated with tales of suffering and survival that became almost mythological family narratives. These children often struggled with the weight of such inheritance. How could their own problems and challenges seem significant compared to what their fathers or grandfathers had endured? Other veterans never spoke about their experiences, maintaining silence that could be equally burdensome for their families. Children knew their fathers had survived something terrible, could see the missing fingers or toes, could sense the psychological scars even if they didn't understand their origin, but received no explanations or narratives to make sense of what they observed. This silence created its own difficulties, leaving children to imagine horrors that might be worse than reality, or to feel excluded from crucial parts of their fathers' lives. The healthiest inheritances seemed to come from veterans who found balance between obsessive retelling and complete silence, who could share their experiences appropriately without overwhelming their families, who could acknowledge the past's significance without being trapped by it, who could pass on lessons and values without demanding that subsequent generations live in the shadow of events they hadn't experienced. These balanced approaches allowed the retreat's memory to serve constructive purposes across generations. Grandchildren might grow up hearing measured stories about survival and resilience that provided inspiration during their own challenges. They might inherit values of mutual support and determination that had sustained their grandfathers through impossible circumstances. They might learn lessons about human capability and limitation that remained relevant in very different contexts. The physical artifacts that survived the retreat took on almost sacred significance for families and communities. A battered canteen carried all the way from Moscow, a torn uniform coat that had provided inadequate protection against the cold, a rusty musket abandoned and later recovered. These objects became tangible connections to events that might otherwise seem distant or unreal. Families preserved these artifacts carefully, passing them down through generations along with stories about the men who had carried them. Museums collected them, displaying them as historical evidence and memorial to suffering. The objects themselves were often unremarkable, standard military equipment, worn and damaged by use and weather. But their provenance, their connection to specific individuals who had endured the retreat, transformed them into relics with emotional and historical power disproportionate to their material value. Letters written during or immediately after the retreat constituted another category of precious artifacts. Some soldiers had managed to write to families during the campaign, sending letters when opportunities arose, trying to reassure loved ones of their survival, even as circumstances grew increasingly desperate. These letters, often brief and optimistic in content despite being written in terrible conditions, provided families with final communications from men who wouldn't survive the retreat. Other letters were written after reaching safety, when survivors attempted to describe to families what they'd experienced. These accounts, written while memories remained fresh and emotions raw, often differed markedly from memoirs composed years later. The immediate post-retreat letters frequently expressed pure relief at survival, overwhelming gratitude for the most basic comforts, and profound grief for lost companions. They conveyed the experience's emotional intensity in ways that later, more polished memoirs sometimes couldn't match. Reading these letters nearly 2 centuries later provides startlingly immediate access to the retreat's human dimensions. A soldier writing to his mother that he's survived but lost all his friends, that he can't stop crying, that he doesn't know how to return to normal life. His anguish remains palpable across the centuries. A young officer describing to his wife how he watched his best friend freeze to death, how he couldn't do anything to save him, how that image haunts his sleeping and waking hours. His trauma transcends the temporal distance. These personal documents remind us that history consists ultimately of individual human experiences, that grand narratives about armies and campaigns and strategic objectives break down into countless individual stories of suffering, courage, fear, love, loss, and hope. The retreat from Moscow killed perhaps 550,000 men, but it didn't kill an abstract mass. It killed individuals, each with names and families and personalities and futures that were extinguished in Russian snow. The demographic research into the campaign's long-term effects revealed unexpected patterns in how communities absorbed such catastrophic losses. Some villages that lost large percentages of their young men in Russia never fully recovered demographically. The missing generation created gaps that affected birth rates for decades. Fewer marriages meant fewer children, which meant fewer working-age adults in subsequent generations, which perpetuated cycles of decline that the initial catastrophe had triggered. Other communities demonstrated remarkable demographic resilience. Despite losing many young men, they attracted migrants from surrounding areas, encouraged higher birth rates among survivors, adapted economic strategies to function with smaller populations, and within a generation or two had recovered their demographic vitality. The factors determining which pattern prevailed appeared to involve complex interactions of economic opportunities, social institutions, geographic advantages or disadvantages, and somewhat mysterious cultural differences in how communities responded to trauma. One interesting finding was that communities with stronger traditions of collective decision-making and resource sharing tended to recover better than more hierarchical or individualistic communities. The former could organize collective responses to challenges, could pool resources and share burdens, could maintain social cohesion even when individual families struggled. The latter often fragmented under stress, with successful individuals or families pulling away from struggling ones rather than maintaining community solidarity. This suggested that social capital, networks of trust, cooperation, and mutual obligation might be as important as economic or physical capital for recovering from catastrophes. Communities rich in social capital could mobilize collective resources, coordinate responses to challenges, and maintain morale and hope, even when material circumstances were dire. Communities poor in social capital struggled even when they possessed greater material resources, because they couldn't effectively coordinate collective action or maintain solidarity under stress. The educational systems that emerged in post-Napoleonic Europe sometimes incorporated lessons from the retreat into curricula, though in ways filtered through national perspectives and political objectives. French schools might teach about the campaign as tragic but necessary resistance to European coalition against revolutionary France, emphasizing soldiers' courage and sacrifice while minimizing Napoleon's strategic errors. Russian schools taught it as patriotic triumph, the defining moment when Russian determination and orthodox faith defeated Western materialism and arrogance. German, Italian, and Polish schools faced more complicated tasks, since their nations had contributed troops to the invasion, but also had complex relationships with both France and Russia. Some emphasized the suffering of soldiers who had been forced to fight in a war that didn't serve their true national interests. Others focused on lessons about the dangers of allowing foreign powers to dominate national decision-making. Still, others tried to extract universal moral lessons about war, ambition, and human suffering that transcended particular national perspectives. These varying educational approaches shaped how successive generations understood the campaign and its significance. Students in different countries learned different versions of the same events, interpretations that supported their respective national narratives and political cultures. A French student might learn that the retreat demonstrated tragic heroism and the ultimate futility of European resistance to French revolutionary ideals. A Russian student might learn that it proved Russian superiority and the invincibility of their homeland against foreign aggression. Neither version was purely false. Both contained elements of truth. But both were also partial and selective, emphasizing certain aspects while minimizing others, interpreting ambiguous evidence in ways that supported predetermined conclusions. This demonstrated how historical memory serves present needs, how education always involves selection and framing, how what actually happened can never be separated entirely from what we believe happened and why it matters. The retreat's influence on European military doctrine extended into the 20th century in sometimes unexpected ways. The disaster taught seemingly clear lessons about the importance of logistics, the dangers of overextended supply lines, the need to account for environmental factors, the limits of what armies could achieve through purely military means. Yet these lessons were repeatedly forgotten or ignored by subsequent generations of military planners. Why did such expensive, obvious lessons fail to prevent similar mistakes? Part of the answer involved the human tendency toward optimism and exceptionalism, the belief that it won't happen to us, or we're different from those who failed before. Napoleon had been overconfident, but surely modern commanders with better technology and training wouldn't make the same errors. The Russian campaign had failed due to specific mistakes that could be avoided with proper planning. This optimism wasn't entirely irrational. Military technology and capabilities did advance significantly over the 19th and 20th centuries. Railways, motorized transport, better weapons, improved communications, all these developments genuinely expanded what armies could accomplish. So each generation had some reason to believe they could succeed where predecessors had failed, that new capabilities would overcome old obstacles. But the fundamental constraints that had destroyed Napoleon's army, distance, weather, logistics, human physical limits, didn't change as much as technology. Russia remained vast, winter remained cold, soldiers still needed food and warmth and rest, and supply lines still struggled to keep pace with advancing armies. The German invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941 demonstrated that even with trucks and tanks and radios, armies still faced the same basic challenges that had destroyed the Grande Armée 130 years earlier. This pattern of learning and forgetting, of hard-won lessons gradually fading until they need to be relearned through fresh disasters, appears throughout military history. Each generation must somehow learn for themselves truths that previous generations already discovered, because knowledge transmitted abstractly through books and lectures never carries the same weight as knowledge earned through direct experience and suffering. The veterans who had frozen in Russia knew in their bones truths about cold weather operations that no staff officer studying maps in a warm office could fully grasp. But those veterans aged and died, and their experiential knowledge died with them, leaving only abstract lessons that subsequent generations understood intellectually but not viscerally. Without the visceral understanding, the lesson seemed less urgent, more subject to exceptions and qualifications, easier to believe might not apply in changed circumstances. This suggested a fundamental limitation in how humans learn from history. We can transmit information across generations easily enough. What happened, when it happened, what the outcomes were. But we struggle to transmit the emotional and experiential dimensions that give that information its full significance and urgency. Knowing intellectually that extreme cold kills soldiers who lack proper equipment differs profoundly from having experienced that cold personally, from having watched friends freeze to death, from carrying in your body the permanent damage that frostbite inflicted. As you drift still deeper towards sleep, this limitation in historical learning might actually offer some comfort. It means you're not responsible for perfectly avoiding all mistakes that others have made before you. You'll learn some lessons the hard way, through your own experience and suffering, because that's how humans learn most deeply. This isn't failure, it's the normal human condition, The soldiers who froze in Russia hadn't failed by not learning perfectly from previous military disasters. They were young men following orders, doing their duty, caught in circumstances beyond their control or understanding. Their suffering taught lessons, but only to those who survived and to subsequent generations willing to listen. And even then, the lessons were imperfect, partial, subject to being forgotten and needing to be relearned. You too will make mistakes despite having access to historical knowledge. You'll sometimes fail to apply lessons that should be obvious. You'll occasionally suffer consequences that seem predictable in hindsight, but weren't clear beforehand. This is normal, human, forgivable. The point isn't to achieve perfection, but to do your best with imperfect knowledge, to learn what you can from your own and others' experiences, and to maintain compassion for yourself and others when understanding proves inadequate. The philosophical implications of the retreat occupied thinkers interested in questions about human nature, free will, determinism, and historical causation. To what extent were the soldiers who died in Russia authors of their own fates, and to what extent were they victims of forces beyond their control? Could they have made different choices that would have led to survival, or were their deaths essentially determined by circumstances that left no real agency? These questions didn't have clear answers. Individual choices certainly mattered. Decisions about when to rest or keep moving, whether to share food or hoard it, how to protect against cold, whether to maintain hope or give up. Some soldiers made choices that increased survival chances, while others made choices that decreased them. So agency was real, and individual decisions influenced outcomes. But individual agency operated within severe constraints. No amount of good choices could save a soldier who happened to be in the wrong place when a Russian artillery shell landed. No brilliant decision-making could compensate for the army's overall logistical failures or for temperatures that exceeded human tolerance regardless of preparation. Luck and circumstances beyond individual control determined who survived and who died, at least as much as personal choices did. This combination of real but limited agency characterized human existence generally, not just the specific circumstances of the retreat. We make choices that matter and influence outcomes, but always within constraints we don't control and can't fully predict. We're neither completely free agents determining our own fates nor completely helpless victims of deterministic forces. We're somewhere in between, able to influence but not fully control outcomes, responsible for our choices but not for all their consequences. The retreat illustrated this condition with unusual clarity because the constraints were so extreme and the stakes so immediate. In normal civilian life, the relationship between choices and outcomes is muddled by complexity and long-time horizons. But in the retreat, the feedback was quick and brutal. Good choices sometimes led to survival. Bad choices often led to death, and chance determined much regardless of choice quality. Recognizing this combination of agency and constraint, choice and fate, might help you approach your own life with appropriate balance. You should make thoughtful choices because they matter and influence outcomes. But you shouldn't blame yourself excessively when outcomes are bad despite good choices. Shouldn't assume you control everything. Shouldn't forget that luck and circumstances beyond your control affect your life at least as much as your decisions do. The soldiers who froze weren't simply victims. They made choices, some wise and some foolish. But they also weren't simply authors of their own fates. They faced circumstances that limited their options and determined many outcomes regardless of their choices. This balance between agency and constraint defined their experience, just as it defines yours. The environmental historians who later studied the 1812-1813 winter discovered it was indeed unusually severe, though perhaps not quite as extreme as some contemporary accounts suggested. Temperatures did drop to extraordinary lows, perhaps 40 to 50 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit in the coldest periods. Snow fell earlier and heavier than typical. The combination of extreme cold, heavy snow and an army completely unprepared for such conditions created catastrophe. But Russian winters were always harsh, and armies that prepared adequately could operate in them. The Swedish army under Charles X had invaded Russia a century earlier in 1708-1709, faced a similarly severe winter, and suffered comparable catastrophe. The lesson wasn't that winter made military operations impossible, but that they required proper preparation, adequate supplies, realistic timelines, and willingness to adapt plans to environmental realities. Napoleon had ignored all these requirements. He'd invaded too late in the campaign season, leaving insufficient time to achieve objectives before winter arrived. He'd failed to stockpile adequate supplies for winter operations. He'd assumed his army could live off the land despite knowing the Russians would implement scorched earth policies. He'd refused to retreat from Moscow when doing so might still have been possible in tolerable conditions, waiting until winter was fully established before beginning withdrawal. Each of these failures compounded the others, creating cascading catastrophe. Better choices at any point might have mitigated the disaster if not prevented it entirely. Invading in April instead of June might have allowed capture of Moscow before winter. Better logistical preparation might have sustained the army even in winter conditions. Retreating from Moscow in September instead of October might have avoided the worst weather, but Napoleon made poor choices at each decision point, and his army paid the price. This wasn't purely bad luck or unforeseeable circumstances. It was failure of judgment, planning, and leadership. The environmental factors that killed his soldiers were extreme but not unprecedented. With proper respect for these factors and adequate preparation, they could have been survived if not overcome. This distinction between genuinely unforeseeable disasters and predictable catastrophes resulting from poor planning and leadership remained important across contexts. Some challenges truly are unprecedented, truly unpredictable, truly beyond what reasonable preparation could address. But many disasters that seem like unforeseeable acts of God actually result from predictable consequences of inadequate preparation and poor decision-making. The retreat fell into the latter category. The suffering was real, the deaths were tragic, but the catastrophe was largely preventable. This made it simultaneously more tragic, so many needless deaths, and more instructive, clear lessons about what not to do. If only those lessons would actually be learned and applied rather than repeatedly forgotten and relearned through fresh disasters. The cultural production inspired by the retreat continued well into the 20th century, long after the last veterans had died and the events had passed entirely into history. Novelists, poets, filmmakers, and other artists repeatedly returned to the retreat as subject matter, each finding in it themes and meanings relevant to their own times and concerns. Soviet filmmakers in the 1940s and 1950s produced movies about 1812 that emphasize parallels with the recent victory over Nazi Germany, highlighting themes of patriotic resistance, scorched earth tactics, winter as ally, and ultimate triumph over arrogant invaders. These films served obvious propaganda purposes, but also expressed genuine pride in the historical precedent and genuine grief for the enormous costs of both wars. French artists in various periods produced works that emphasized tragedy, heroism, and the complex legacy of Napoleon. Some portrayed the retreat sympathetically, focusing on soldiers' suffering and courage. Others took more critical approaches, depicting the campaign as cautionary tale about ambition and folly. The varying emphasis reflected ongoing debates in French culture about how to remember and evaluate Napoleon's legacy. German and Polish artists faced complicated tasks in representing events where their ancestors had fought on the losing side in causes that served foreign interests. Some emphasized the universal human dimensions, suffering, courage, loyalty, that transcended national allegiances. Others explored themes of exploitation, of soldiers used as pawns in conflicts that didn't serve their interests, of the gap between leaders' rhetoric and soldiers' reality. These artistic treatments kept the retreat alive in cultural memory long after it might otherwise have faded into obscurity. Each new generation encountered the story through fresh artistic interpretations that made it relevant to contemporary concerns. The specific details varied, but core themes, the limits of human ambition, the power of nature, the suffering of common soldiers, the possibility of survival against terrible odds, remained constant and continually meaningful. As you finally approach the deepest stages of sleep, perhaps these accumulated layers of meaning and interpretation surrounding the retreat offer final comfort. The soldiers who froze weren't simply statistics, weren't just casualties in a military disaster. They were human beings whose experiences and suffering mattered enough that generations of people have returned to their story, finding in it meanings and lessons that remain vital nearly 2 centuries later. Your own suffering, your own struggles, your own experiences of cold and hardship. These also matter, are also meaningful, are also part of the ongoing human story of facing challenges, discovering strength, surviving trials, and continuing forward. You're connected to those frozen soldiers through shared humanity, through the simple fact of being human, of facing difficulties, of needing to find strength and meaning despite hardship. The archaeological evidence of the retreat discovered over the subsequent 2 centuries provided physical confirmation of events that might otherwise seem too terrible to be fully believed. Excavations along the retreat route uncovered mass graves containing hundreds or thousands of bodies, hastily buried in shallow pits during the campaign, or left on the surface to be covered gradually by soil and vegetation over decades. These graves yielded poignant artifacts, buttons stamped with regimental insignia identifying which units had passed through particular locations, personal items like pocket watches or religious medals that soldiers had carried from home, fragments of uniforms and equipment showing the inadequate protection soldiers had against the cold, even preserved remains showing evidence of frostbite, malnutrition and disease. One mass grave discovered near Vilnius in modern Lithuania contained more than 3,000 bodies, identified through buttons and equipment fragments as primarily soldiers from German and Polish units. The bodies had been thrown into large pits without ceremony or individual burial, simply disposed of as quickly as possible by survivors too exhausted and desperate to observe proper funeral rites. The lack of personal effect suggested that everything of value had been stripped from the corpses before burial, not from disrespect necessarily, but from desperate need among the living. Forensic analysis of skeletal remains from these mass graves revealed the physical toll the retreat had taken. Many skeletons showed evidence of severe malnutrition, bones weakened by starvation, growth disruptions in younger soldiers, signs of vitamin deficiencies. Many showed damage consistent with frostbite, missing fingers or toes, lesions where tissue had frozen and died. Some showed evidence of violent death, cut marks from weapons, bullet wounds, blunt force trauma, suggesting they'd been killed by Russian forces or possibly even their own desperate comrades fighting over resources. The age distribution of the dead was striking. Most were young men in their 20s or early 30s, the prime military age. But the graves also contained teenagers, some perhaps as young as 14 or 15, and older men in their 40s or even 50s. Napoleon's army had conscripted widely, taking anyone who could march and carry a weapon, regardless of whether they had the physical resilience to survive harsh campaigning. The youngest and oldest soldiers generally died first during the retreat, their bodies less able to tolerate extreme cold and privation. But the mass graves showed that even men in their prime of life, soldiers who should have been most capable of survival, died in enormous numbers when conditions exceeded human tolerances. Strength and youth provided some advantage, but couldn't overcome sustained exposure to temperatures far below zero, combined with inadequate food, clothing, and rest. The horse remains discovered along the retreat route were even more numerous than human burials. Tens of thousands of horse skeletons marked the path from Moscow to the Polish border, testament to the catastrophic loss of the animals that had pulled wagons, carried cavalry, and transported artillery. Without these horses, the army's mobility and logistics collapsed completely, accelerating the disaster. The pattern of horse deaths revealed the escalating crisis. Early in the retreat, horses died primarily from overwork and inadequate fodder. As the army penetrated deeper into winter, they began dying from cold, their bodies unable to maintain core temperature when their feed rations diminished. Finally, as the situation became desperate, many horses were slaughtered deliberately, their meat providing food for starving soldiers even as their deaths further crippled the army's capabilities. The archaeological evidence also documented the progressive breakdown of military organization and discipline. Early in the retreat, burial practices maintained some order, bodies placed in organized rows, sometimes with markers indicating regiments or nationalities. Later burials showed increasing chaos, bodies jumbled together without organization, mixed with dead horses and abandoned equipment, suggesting that by this point survivors were simply disposing of corpses as expediently as possible, without regard for military protocol or human dignity. The final stage graves, from the last weeks of the retreat near the Russian border, were the most chaotic. Bodies lay in ditches and ravines where they'd fallen, barely covered or not covered at all, left where they died because survivors lacked the strength or will to bury them. These sites provided the grimmest evidence of the retreat's final stages, when the army had essentially disintegrated into a desperate mob of individuals focused purely on personal survival. Yet even in these final, most desperate sites, archaeologists occasionally found evidence of continued human compassion. Two bodies buried together with arms intertwined, suggesting friends who had died supporting each other. A body carefully positioned despite the chaos, perhaps someone taking a moment to show final respect to a fallen comrade, even when such gestures seemed pointless. Small caches of personal items buried deliberately, perhaps soldiers hiding precious possessions they could no longer carry, hoping to retrieve them someday, or at least prevent them from being looted. These small evidences of persistent humanity amid catastrophic breakdown were perhaps the most moving findings. They suggested that even in the absolute worst circumstances, when survival required pure selfishness, and when normal moral constraints had largely collapsed, some people still maintained connection to values beyond mere self-preservation. Not everyone, not even most people necessarily, but enough that traces of their compassion survived in the archaeological record. The letters and diaries recovered from mass graves provided even more intimate access to soldiers' experiences and thoughts. Paper doesn't preserve well under most conditions, but in some graves where conditions happened to favour preservation, searchers found documents that had survived nearly 2 centuries buried with their owners. These recovered documents were often heartbreaking. A letter written but never sent found in a soldier's pocket telling his wife he loved her and asking her to care for their children. A diary with entries becoming shorter and more desperate as the retreat progressed, the final entry simply stating, "Can't go on," before trailing off. A religious text with passages about endurance and faith heavily marked, showing the comfort the owner had sought in Scripture during his final days. One particularly poignant discovery was a series of letters from home found on a soldier's body, carefully wrapped in oilcloth to protect them from weather. These letters from the soldier's mother and young wife had been written months earlier, before the invasion, full of mundane family news and expressions of love and concern. The soldier had carried them all the way to Moscow and back, protecting them carefully even as he lost everything else, until finally freezing to death with these precious connections to home and family still in his possession. Such discoveries made the retreat's catastrophe personal and immediate in ways that statistics and military histories could never achieve. Each recovered letter or diary represented a specific individual with a name, a family, a life that had been interrupted and destroyed. Collectively, they testified to the enormous human cost of the campaign, the suffering multiplied across hundreds of thousands of individual lives, each one as complex and valuable as the few whose stories happened to survive in recoverable form. The environmental changes along the retreat route also left long-lasting marks. Forests that had been cut down for firewood by the retreating army took decades to regrow. Fields that had been trampled and churned by hundreds of thousands of marching feet and wagon wheels showed disturbed soil patterns, visible in aerial photographs even in the 20th century. Rivers where bridges had been destroyed, or where crossings had occurred, showed altered courses and erosion patterns resulting from the army's passage. Local ecosystems were disrupted by the sudden influx of decaying organic matter. Thousands of human and horse corpses decomposing over months and years, releasing nutrients that altered soil chemistry and plant communities. Some areas showed unusually lush vegetation growth in subsequent years, the enriched soil supporting more vigorous plant life. Other areas showed damage that persisted for decades, as if the land itself had been traumatized by the catastrophe it had witnessed. The local populations living along the retreat route maintained their own memories and traditions related to the campaign, often quite different from the official national narratives. Peasant families passed down stories about the terrible winter when foreign soldiers appeared in impossible numbers, desperate and dying, some threatening and violent, others pitiable in their suffering. These family stories often included details about specific incidents: a group of French soldiers who sought shelter in a barn and froze to death overnight, a wounded officer who was given food and hidden from pursuing Cossacks, a starving soldier who stole a chicken and was killed by angry villagers. These local memories were often more ambivalent than national narratives about heroic resistance or tragic sacrifice. The foreign soldiers were simultaneously invaders, who had brought destruction and suffering to Russia, and pitiful human beings whose suffering evoked compassion, even from those who considered them enemies. Local people sometimes helped dying soldiers despite the risks, motivated by basic human sympathy for suffering, even when the sufferers were technically enemies. Other local stories described violence and atrocity. Soldiers who had stolen food from starving peasants, who had burned homes for firewood, who had killed civilians who resisted or simply happened to be in their way. The retreat hadn't brought out only noble qualities in desperate soldiers. Some had committed crimes driven by desperation, others by simple breakdown of moral constraints when normal law and order disappeared. These local narratives, preserved in oral tradition and later recorded by folklorists and historians, provided important counterbalance to sanitized official histories. They reminded that war's reality was always more complex and morally ambiguous than patriotic narratives suggested, that victims and perpetrators often weren't clearly distinguished, that the same people could act nobly in one moment and shamefully the next, that moral judgment needed to account for extreme circumstances that most people never faced. The linguistic traces of the retreat persisted in surprising ways. Russian developed new words and expressions related to the campaign. French soldiers were called Français, and this word took on connotations beyond simply meaning French. It implied foolish arrogance, inadequate preparation for harsh conditions, the gap between confident beginnings and catastrophic endings. To say someone had pulled a Français meant they had started something ambitious without adequate preparation and suffered predictable consequences. Similarly, French developed new slang expressions derived from the retreat. C'est la Bérésina, it's the Berezina, became an idiom meaning a total disaster, referencing the catastrophic river crossing where thousands died. The expression remained common in French well into the 21st century, long after most people using it had forgotten its historical origin, demonstrating how traumatic events become embedded in language and persist across generations. Polish, German, and Italian also incorporated words and expressions related to the campaign, each reflecting their particular national experiences and perspectives. These linguistic traces provided subtle reminders of historical trauma, keeping the campaign alive in collective memory through everyday speech even when direct historical knowledge faded. The medical knowledge developed through studying retreat survivors and their injuries had lasting impact on how frostbite and hypothermia were understood and treated. The massive number of cold injury cases provided doctors with unprecedented opportunities to observe, compare, and develop treatment protocols. While their understanding remained limited by pre-modern medical knowledge, they didn't understand cellular damage mechanisms or have effective treatments for many conditions. They nevertheless accumulated practical knowledge that saved lives in subsequent cold weather situations. The recognition that gradual rewarming was essential for frostbite treatment came partly from observations of retreat survivors. Doctors noticed that soldiers whose frozen limbs were warmed too quickly often developed worse outcomes than those who warmed gradually. This led to protocols emphasizing slow, gentle rewarming that remained standard practice into the modern era. Similarly, the observation that alcohol increased vulnerability to cold despite creating subjective warmth sensations led to important changes in cold weather survival advice. Before the retreat, alcohol had been widely believed to provide protection against cold. The retreat's experience, where soldiers who drank heavily often died faster than those who remained sober, challenged this belief and eventually changed official recommendations. The psychological understanding of trauma also advanced through studying retreat survivors, though the conceptual frameworks remained primitive by modern standards. Doctors noticed that many survivors suffered persistent psychological symptoms, nightmares, anxiety, difficulty readjusting to civilian life, exaggerated startle responses, depression. They didn't have effective treatments for these conditions, but they at least recognized them as legitimate medical issues rather than simply moral weakness or malingering. This recognition laid groundwork for gradually more sophisticated understanding of psychological trauma that would develop over subsequent generations. The retreat survivors, along with veterans of other traumatic conflicts, provided evidence that extreme experiences could cause lasting psychological damage, that this damage deserved recognition and treatment, that recovery required more than simply willpower or moral fortitude. As you rest now in these final moments before true deep sleep, perhaps knowing that even catastrophes contribute to human knowledge and understanding provides some meaning. The soldiers who suffered and died weren't simply victims. Their experiences, however terrible, taught lessons that benefited subsequent generations. Their trauma wasn't redeemed by these lessons. Nothing could redeem such suffering. But it at least wasn't completely meaningless. Your own struggles and suffering, whatever their nature, similarly aren't meaningless. They teach you things about yourself, about human nature, about life's realities that can't be learned easily any other way. They may help you assist others facing similar challenges. They become part of your story, part of what makes you who you are, part of your contribution to the ongoing human journey of learning and growth through experience. The soldiers who froze in Russia contributed to human knowledge through their suffering. You contribute through yours. This doesn't make the suffering good or desirable. It would be better if such lessons could be learned without such costs. But given that suffering exists, that challenges are inevitable, that hardship is part of human life, finding meaning and growth through difficulty becomes important for making bearable what cannot be avoided. So sleep now, finally and fully, knowing that your story, like theirs, is part of something larger than individual experience, that your struggles connect you to countless others across time who have faced their own trials, that the strength you develop through your challenges becomes part of humanity's accumulated resilience, passed forward through generations just as the retreat survivors' resilience has been passed to you. The retreat from Moscow ended 2 centuries ago, but its echoes continue in archaeological discoveries, in language, in medical knowledge, in cultural memory, in the eternal human story of surviving catastrophes and finding ways to continue. You're part of that story now and always, connected across time to all who have struggled and endured and discovered within themselves strength they didn't know they possessed. Rest peacefully in that connection, in that continuity, in the knowledge that you're never truly alone in your struggles, because you're part of this long human journey of surviving winters both literal and metaphorical, of enduring cold both physical and spiritual, of discovering that humans are simultaneously fragile and resilient, limited and capable, mortal and enduring. The coldest winter eventually ended. Spring came, life continued, and so it always does, and so it will for you, carried forward by the same resilience that sustained those frozen soldiers, the same determination that brought survivors home, the same hope that enabled rebuilding after catastrophe, the same strength that lives in all of us, waiting to be discovered when circumstances demand it. Good night, and may your sleep be deep, and your dreams be warm, and your awakening tomorrow bring renewed faith in your capacity to survive whatever challenges await, knowing that you carry within yourself everything necessary to endure them, as countless others have endured theirs across all of human history. The story continues, you continue, life continues, and in that continuation lies all of human hope and all of human achievement, the simple, profound act of surviving, enduring, and moving forward despite everything that conspires against us, choosing life over surrender, hope over despair, continuation over cessation, always and forever in the eternal human journey through all winters toward spring. Sleep now, deeply and peacefully, and rest in the certain knowledge that spring always comes, that dawn always breaks, that the coldest winter always ends, and that you possess within yourself the strength to survive until it does. Good night.